All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's review and go through key ideas of the American West following the Civil War. There are two key ideas that you want to make sure you know and understand. It helps put the various components of the West together. And the first idea is that the federal government actively promoted the movement and development of the West by controlling American Indian populations and economic settlement by whites and promoting them, right? The second idea is that economic development in mining, farming, and ranching increased trade and brought cheaper goods for some Americans, but often at the cost of farmers who will seek to organize collectively to combat these problems that they face. The national government is going to facilitate Western expansion and development through various laws that I've already listed below. These should be familiar to you: the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railroad Act, the Timber Act, and the Desert Irrigation Act. The government will also protect its interstate commerce power in the Supreme Court case Wabash v. Illinois. And they're going to use legislative and military means to isolate American Indian tribes and, quote-unquote, conquer the West. Throughout American history, the idea of the frontier was very different from the reality. In American history, the frontier has a concept of a place of adventure and opportunity, that it was empty land awaiting civilization, that it was a fresh beginning for Americans. If you failed in the East, you could just pick up and move west. As I previously stated, there's very diverse tribes across the West. Most of the American Indian tribes in the West are going to be nomadic. Around 2/3 of them will be nomadic, following the buffalo herds on the Great Plains. And you can see on this map just some prominent American Indian tribes that you can see here on the Great Plains. The Sioux are probably the most well-known. They're the ones that I would like for you guys to know specifically. There's the Cheyenne, the Navajo in the American Southwest, the Apache. As you can see, they are in Texas, but they will note that they will be being pushed further west. All of these Native American tribes will be pushed further and further west. During this time period in the 1850s, the U.S. government develops a specific reservation policy. And a reservation are plots of land with definitive boundaries, as in lines of longitude and latitude. If you recall, Andrew Jackson's Indian removal just said that they had to relocate past the Mississippi River. And that's a very vague statement. Reservation policies beginning in the 1850s have definitive boundaries to them. As white settlement increased on the Great Plains and in the West, so increased conflict with American Indian groups. In the 1870s, the United States government will pass the Indian Appropriation Act, which ended independent nation status by the American tribes, and that law nullified all previous treaties. So various Native American groups were forced to quickly negotiate new treaties with specific reservations and specific plots of land. That will result and will cause increased conflict in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. The Red River War, the Second Sioux War. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce will move his tribe out of the American borders and move them into Canada. He will surrender in 1877. And by 1890, the Battle of Wounded Knee, or the Wounded Knee Massacre, which killed over 300 Sioux Indians in the Dakotas, will be the final conflict with American Indian tribes out west. That date, 1890, is considered the end of the Indian Wars. I'm always struck by this photograph. It is a pile of buffalo skulls. In 1850, there was an estimated 60 million buffalo in the American West. At the turn of the century, 1900, there are some 2,000 herds left, and today that population has risen to around 350,000. The United States is going to continue its policy of assimilation to end tribal identity and to assimilate to become American through practices such as education, job training, teach them English and Western dress, and to Christianize them. There was various boarding schools for Native Americans. The most famous one was the Carlisle Boarding School in Pennsylvania. That's where those photographs were taken. You can see there. The other important idea in assimilation and a book that you do need to know is A Century of Dishonor. Helen Hunt Jackson sought to chronicle the injustices of the American Indian tribes and to bring sympathy for the natives, which it did. But it also brought increased support for ending and eliminating Indian culture and actually facilitated assimilation. In 1887, the United States government is going to pass the Dawes Severalty Act. You do need to know this. Sometimes it's just called the Dawes Act. I would like for you guys to know it as the Dawes Severalty Act, which broke up tribal identities and land. So it ends tribal ownership of land and divided land and gave plots of land to Indian families, not tribal ownership, but family ownership. The result and the effects of the Dawes Act will be 47 million acres are kept for American Indians. And you may think that's a lot, but except when you think that they gave 90 million acres to white settlers, companies, and individuals, those who could not civilize enough for the American government. And the Dawes Severalty Act will be enforced until FDR in the New Deal in the 1930s passes the Indian Reorganization Act, and we'll look at that later on this year. Let's focus on white opportunities out west. As I mentioned at the top of this video, there's 3 different areas: mining, cattle ranching, and farming. Mining was a key economic foundation out west. It begins in California with the gold rush. You should also be aware of the discovery of silver in Nevada, the Comstock Lode, and gold in Pikes Peak, Colorado. Most miners in the 1860s were Chinese, but because of the profitability that Chinese workers were gaining in California, the United States government will soon pass the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which banned Chinese immigration. And it's the first major act that limits immigration in the United States. Farming, as I previously said, the Homestead Act is incredibly important to the settlement of the Great Plains. The problem with making a life out in the Great Plains is the lack of trees to build homes, and so homesteaders built a sod house, and they were known as sod busters, and that's made out of sod, a type of soil in the Great Plains. 2/3 of homesteaders in the American West will fail. They will fail to make it 5 years by 1900. So cattle ranching becomes an important part of the United States economy. It was popular in Texas by the vaqueros, or the cowboys, and it was profitable in the early stages because the land and the grass was free. With the development of the invention of barbed wire, and the enclosure of farms, it becomes more difficult to move the cattle in the long drives up to the stockyards that were centered around Abilene, Kansas. And so the long drives end in the 1880s. And the 1890 census declared that the frontier has been settled. That concept of the frontier having been closed was further developed by a historian known as Frederick Jackson Turner and his argument, his thesis. He wrote the book, The Significance of the Frontier on American History, published in 1893. He argued about the importance of the concept of the frontier, that it shaped American culture, and it acted as a social leveler for some, mainly white men, but it also fostered wasteful attitudes towards natural resources. Jackson's thesis is still debated today about whether or not his argument's correct, and is an important part of the formulation of American history. Farmers have to deal with lots of problems. Increased production leads to falling prices. They increase the supply so much that the price of wheat actually falls because there's an oversupply, and that means less profit for farmers. They also have to pay for the cost of new machinery. They have to compete with foreign goods, and they don't like tariffs. They also have to pay high prices to ship their goods. The railroads controlled a monopoly in an area because they were the only lifeline outside the town or the area, village that you lived outside of. And so railroad companies knew that they could charge and hike up prices when times were tight, and farmers would have no choice but to pay it. And of course, dealing with natural disasters as well. And so because of these problems, farmers start to organize. They really focus on educating farmers and building co-ops to sell directly to consumers. They are effective at passing Granger laws at the state level. Granger laws are at the state level, which would set prices for crop transportation and the storage of excess wheat to make sure that no farmer was getting price gouged. The Farmers Alliance and the Colored Farmers Alliance will attempt to do similar things. There are two important Supreme Court cases. The first case is Munn v. Illinois. That Supreme Court statement said that states can regulate industries that affect the common good. And since farming affects the common good, states can keep their Granger laws. That, however, that court case was overturned in Wabash v. Illinois, saying that states can't regulate interstate commerce because all of those grains were moving out of the state. The United States government will also pass the Interstate Commerce Act designed to regulate interstate trade. However, it was ineffective and it failed to regulate the railroads, which were the real cause of those problems. Finally, last two pieces, we have the development of the conservation movement. This was greatly aided by the expansion of photography, which showed the destruction of the West, but also the majesty of the West. Yellowstone became the first national park in 1872, and you have the creation of the forest reserve system to regulate the use of timber and the cutting down of forests. And you have two competing ideals here when it comes to the environment. There's conservationists and preservationists. Conservationists want to regulate the use of natural resources for future generations. They want to still use natural resources for the Industrial Revolution, but they want to use it in a judicious way. Teddy Roosevelt is a famous conservationist. Preservationists wanted to preserve it from human interference. They wanted to keep it pristine. And they were led by John Muir, who helped to found the Sierra Club. The majesty of the West is preserved in the school of art known as the Rocky Mountain School. You should be familiar with that term. This specific painting is The Valley of Yosemite by Albert Bierstadt. And my personal favorite, and to end you with this video, would be Thomas Moran's The Grand Canyon at Yellowstone, painted in 1872.